The rain had been falling for almost 2 full days by the time the last night rolled around. Not the kind of gentle, pattering rain that can feel peaceful when you're out in the woods, but a non-stop, hard, soaking rain that felt like it was trying to wash everything off the face of the earth. Everything was wet. Every bit of firewood was soaked. Every piece of clothing was damp. Every corner of our tent was dripping or slick. The air smelled like mud and rotting leaves and mildew. We were tent camping in southern Ohio, deep in one of the more remote parks, just trying to get through the final night of what had started as a fun family trip. My daughters were asleep in their sleeping bags beside us, curled up and shivering in their sleep. My wife, who was 6 months pregnant at the time, lay next to me quietly, trying her best to rest, though neither of us really could. We had pulled our tent up onto a higher, flatter bit of ground surrounded by large trees when we'd first arrived, thinking it would keep us dry if it rained. And for the most part, it did. But after 48 hours of nonstop water pounding down, even the best ground turns to mush. The tree roots around us had started looking exposed. Small rivulets of water were constantly running under the rainfly and soaking the underside of the tent. We had laid down plastic sheeting beneath us, but even that couldn't keep the wet from seeping into everything. We'd eaten cold food all day because the fire wouldn't catch, no matter how much lighter fluid I wasted on it. It was too wet to even sit outside, so the 4 of us had just been cooped up in the tent, reading, playing cards, and trying to keep the kids from getting stir-crazy. It was miserable, but we were holding on. I kept telling myself we only had to make it one more night. Just get through this last stretch and we'd pack up in the morning and head back to dry clothes, hot showers, and real food. I must have drifted off sometime after midnight. I was on edge and uncomfortable, but my body gave out after 2 rough nights. When it happened, it was like the ground itself cracked open. The sound was enormous, like thunder but lower and angrier. At first I thought it was thunder, maybe a lightning strike nearby. The tent shook violently, and then it felt like the whole world caved in on top of us. A massive weight crushed down the center of the tent. The canvas collapsed over us instantly. The sound of ripping fabric, splitting wood, and shattering glass hit all at once, mixed with screams. I couldn't even move at first. There was something hard pressing down on my back, pinning my chest into the ground. My face was smashed into my sleeping bag, and I couldn't lift my head. For a few terrifying seconds, I couldn't breathe. It felt like the air was being squeezed out of me. Then I realized what had happened. A tree, one of those massive oak trees, easily 80 or 90 feet tall, had come down right on top of us. The ground must have gotten so waterlogged that the roots just gave up. The force of it coming down was enough to flatten the tent, crush my Jeep parked a few feet away, and roll enough to pin the entire center of our campsite. I couldn't even process it right away. All I could hear was the pounding of rain still falling on the broken tent canvas, and my own heart thundering in my ears. I shifted slowly, testing where the weight was. My right leg was stuck under something heavy, probably a limb, but my upper body was mostly free after a bit of struggling. My hands were shaking as I forced myself to move inch by inch. My mind was racing. I didn't know if my wife was okay. I didn't know if the girls were okay. The idea that they could have been crushed right next to me and I wouldn't have been able to stop it. It tore something in me. I pushed, pulled, clawed at the broken canvas and tree bark until I could sit up. The rain was still coming down hard, but I could see through a tear in the tent that the tree was huge, easily 5 feet wide at the base, and it had split into a dozen massive branches when it fell. Some had shattered against the ground, others rested on top of what was left of the Jeep, but one thick branch, maybe as thick as my torso, had rolled across the middle of our tent. That's what had pinned us. I could hear my wife making a sound. It wasn't a scream, more like a strained moan. That got me moving faster. I found her maybe 2 feet away, curled onto her side, her lower body trapped under the same massive branch. Her face was pale and she was shaking. I shouted for her, but she didn't respond, just stared at me, eyes wide with pain and fear. I crawled to her, ignoring the sharp pains in my ribs and hip. My hands were numb, and I couldn't get a good grip on the tree limb at first. I tried everything. I used a broken piece of the tent pole as a lever. I pushed with both hands. I screamed out loud as I strained to move it, Inch by inch, it shifted. Eventually, with one final shove, I managed to roll it just far enough to pull her free. Her left leg was twisted at a strange angle, and she couldn't put weight on it, but she was conscious and able to move. Next were the girls. They had been sleeping toward the other end of the tent, farther from the impact. I crawled through the broken, soaked mess of sleeping bags and ripped nylon until I found them. Both were huddled under a collapsed part of the tent, soaked and shaking, but alive. One had a cut on her forehead. The other was screaming and clutching her arm. I pulled them out one by one, dragging them carefully into the open air. I kept saying over and over, "You're okay, you're okay." But I don't even know if they could hear me over the rain and their own cries. Once we were all out from under the wreckage, I helped my wife sit against a tree stump and wrapped her in whatever dry layer I could find. The girls clung to her while I stumbled through the dark to check the Jeep. It was crushed. The roof was completely flattened, the windshield blown out. If any of us had been inside when it fell, we would have been killed instantly. Seeing it like that made me realize just how close we came. We could have all died that night easily. No warning, no second chances. I grabbed our emergency kit that had been stored in a side compartment, miraculously untouched, and used the first aid supplies to clean my daughter's wounds. My older daughter had a broken arm. My wife's ankle was definitely broken too, but we were all breathing. We were all talking. We were all alive. As the sun started to come up hours later, the rain finally began to let up. The forest was destroyed in places. Branches, broken trees, flooded ground. But it was also quiet in a way that felt heavy. I managed to flag down help with the emergency whistle and a tarp I hung on a broken limb near the road we'd driven in on. A ranger came down about an hour later and called for help. They had to send an off-road ambulance in to get my wife out, and later told us it was the worst tree fall accident they'd seen in years that hadn't ended in a fatality. We spent a couple nights in the hospital. The girls were banged up but fine. My wife's ankle needed surgery, but the baby was okay. Somehow, against all odds, he was perfectly fine. Strong heartbeat, no complications. A few months later, he was born healthy and perfect. We named him Oakley. I think about that night more often than I'd like to admit. Not because of the fear, but because of how close we came to losing everything. The tent, the Jeep, the gear, none of that mattered. We walked away, broken and bruised, but alive. That tree could have ended us, but it didn't. We got out. We held on. We survived. And I will never, ever camp near big trees again. It was the middle of July, hot and sticky, the kind of heat that clings to your skin no matter how many times you jump in the water. I was camping with my 11-year-old niece at Keystone State Park in Pennsylvania. It was a busy weekend, the kind where every single site is taken and kids are riding bikes up and down the gravel loops until sunset. The air smelled like sunscreen and charcoal, and the sound of distant radios mixed with cicadas and the occasional slam of a car door. We'd set up our little two-person tent beneath a shady cluster of tall trees, not far from the public lake. Our site was across from another camper's, a solo setup, neat and quiet. We'd noticed an older man there when we first arrived the day before. He had one of those big canvas tents, the kind you only bother with if you're staying a while. We waved to each other in passing. He seemed content to sit in his folding chair reading, mostly to himself. That afternoon, we'd gone swimming. The lake was cold at first but perfect after a few minutes. We swam until our skin got that wrinkled look, and then we laid out on the grass to dry, eating peanut butter crackers from my backpack. We didn't bring towels, so our clothes stuck to us when we changed back into them in the little concrete bathhouse. My niece kept dragging her feet, collecting smooth rocks along the path back to our site. When we finally rounded the bend and our tent came into view, I slowed down. There were 2 park ranger SUVs and a local police cruiser parked near the road, just feet from our site. A yellow rope was draped loosely between some trees, sectioning off the site across from us, the one where the older man had been. 2 rangers were standing near the tent. One of them was talking into a radio, and another officer was scribbling in a small notebook. It looked too serious to be something small, and my stomach started to feel heavy. We kept walking, quiet now. My niece looked up at me, sensing something wasn't right. As we got closer, one of the rangers walked over to us, holding up his hand to stop us before we reached our own picnic table. He leaned in and quietly told me there'd been an incident at the neighboring campsite. I nodded slowly, waiting for him to explain. My niece was holding my hand but trying to wiggle closer, craning her neck to see what was going on. I gently stepped in front of her, but she wouldn't stop trying to look. The ranger lowered his voice even more. He told me the man staying across from us had passed away in his sleep. They believed it was natural causes. He was supposed to check out that morning, but when he didn't come by the ranger station or answer his phone, someone went to check. They found him in his tent, just lying there, peaceful apparently. I blinked, trying to keep my expression calm. I nodded again. I didn't really know how to respond to something like that. I asked if we needed to move sites, but the ranger said it wouldn't be necessary. They were nearly done and would have the area cleared out within the hour. My niece, overhearing part of it, asked if someone had gotten hurt. I gave her a look and told her we'd talk later, but she wouldn't drop it. While the ranger went back to the others, my niece kept whispering questions. She was too smart for vague answers. I told her someone had passed away, an older man who was camping alone. She went quiet for a second, then looked back across the gravel road. His tent was still there, the flap zipped shut. A red and white cooler sat untouched on the table, and a small pile of firewood was stacked neatly beside the fire ring. His camping chair was still there too, folded and leaning against a tree. It made the whole thing feel surreal. He couldn't be gone. It looked like he could come back any second and sit down with a sandwich and a cold soda. A few minutes later, a white van arrived and two people in dark clothing stepped out. One carried a clipboard and the other opened the back doors. I tried to distract my niece with snacks, pulling out a bag of trail mix and some Capri Suns, but her attention kept going back to that campsite. I didn't want her to see anything she shouldn't, but she wasn't dumb. She watched the same way people do when they know they shouldn't look but can't help it. They waited until we'd gone into our tent for a bit before they started moving things. I could hear them zipping the tent open, the sounds muffled but unmistakable. I told my niece to lay down for a bit. I pulled out a card game and tried to keep her occupied. She played a few rounds with me but wasn't really paying attention. Eventually, everything quieted down. The vans and police cars left. One ranger stayed behind and put up a sign at the site entrance saying, "Closed for maintenance." They hadn't packed up the man's gear though. His tent, cooler, wood, and some other stuff were still there. I guess someone else would come for it later. I didn't know what the procedure was for something like that. Later that evening, my niece was poking at the fire pit with a stick while I cooked up some hot dogs over the flames. She kept looking across the way. Then, just as casually as anything, she said, "Can we keep his firewood? He doesn't need it now." I looked up from the fire. I didn't say anything for a minute. I just stared at her, unsure whether to scold her or laugh or feel horrified. She wasn't being mean or cold. She wasn't old enough yet to understand the weight of death the way adults do. To her, it was just a thing that happened, and now there was a pile of unused firewood sitting there, and we were still going to be here another night. I told her we'd leave it alone for now. Someone might come to collect his things. She shrugged and went back to toasting her marshmallow like it was just any other day. But I couldn't stop thinking about the man across from us. That night, as the air cooled and the sky went from orange to dark blue, I sat in my camping chair long after my niece had gone into the tent to sleep. The fire crackled quietly, and the light from it barely reached the edges of our little clearing. I looked over at that tent across the road. The lantern inside had been turned off, the flap still closed. It was quiet now, no one coming in or out. The kind of stillness that makes you feel like you're the last person awake on Earth. It bothered me in a way I didn't expect. Not in a scary way, but something deeper. Something about how sudden it was. He had been alive yesterday, probably cooking his own dinner, maybe reading in that same chair, listening to the same birds and kids laughing nearby. And now he was just gone. No warning. No one around to notice right away. Just a quiet end in a sleeping bag under some trees in a Pennsylvania campground. The next morning, the firewood was still there. No one had come to collect anything yet. I packed up slowly, taking my time. My niece asked again about the wood. I just shook my head and told her it wasn't ours to take. She didn't argue. We drove out of the campground a little after 10. The ranger gave us a polite wave at the exit. As we pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. His tent was still there. The site looked untouched, like someone had just gone for a short walk and would be back soon. But I knew he wasn't coming back, and I haven't forgotten that quiet little site across from ours. I don't think I ever will. I grew up camping and off-roading in the desert canyons, the kind of places where you can't hear another soul for miles unless they're with you. It was a part of life for us. My grandparents owned a ranch out in the middle of nowhere, and after they passed, my parents took it over. We were all raised out there, learning early on how to handle being alone, how to live with no one to rely on but yourself and the people you came with. It wasn't about being paranoid, it was just the reality of where we lived. The nearest town was hours away. Cell service was spotty at best. When something went wrong, there wasn't a cop or ambulance coming to help. That meant we all learned to shoot and defend early. Even the youngest kids knew what to do in an emergency. That day, we had the whole family out in one of the more remote canyon areas that was legal for target practice. It was a wide, flat space surrounded by low, rocky hills. You had to go out of your way to find it, so we figured we'd be completely alone. 15 or 16 adults, maybe a dozen kids. All family. We brought tables, coolers, ammo cans, shade tents. 2 long 6-foot folding tables were laid out, each covered in our guns. Rifles, pistols, shotguns, everything was legal, all registered, all handled with the kind of care that came from generations of experience. People would pick one up, try it out for a while, clean it, then swap for another. It was a calm, warm day, not hot yet, just dry and quiet except for the sound of occasional gunshots echoing off the rocks and the buzz of cicadas somewhere in the brush. The younger kids were under one of the tents building forts out of stones and eating snacks. The teens were split between watching the shooting and helping reload. Some of the adults sat in folding chairs just soaking in the sun. It felt like just another good family day in the desert. Then we saw the trucks. 2 of them, black and dusty, old body styles. They came in fast, bouncing over the rocky path like they didn't care about the suspension. We all stopped shooting as soon as they crested the ridge and started heading down into our clearing. Everyone went quiet. No one said anything, but we all felt it. Something was off. They didn't park like people coming to say hello. They pulled in side by side, noses out, blocking off the one exit we had. Not a friendly wave, not a hand out the window. Just parked, front to front with our line of trucks, boxing us in. Doors popped open. 4 men got out of each truck, 8 total. Each one had a rifle or shotgun strapped over their shoulder. They weren't dressed for hiking or shooting or any kind of desert work. Baggy clothes, flashy sneakers, faces hidden by sunglasses or flat-billed hats. The way they moved didn't feel casual. It felt like they were walking into a place they thought was theirs now. But what they didn't expect was what they saw in return. Every adult in my family immediately stood up. No yelling, no panic. Everyone just moved with this quiet, practiced urgency. We'd been raised for this. My dad picked up his rifle. My uncle unholstered a pistol from under his chair. I grabbed the 12 gauge off the corner of the table, checked the chamber out of habit, and stood with it at my side. Everyone else did the same. Pistols hung at people's hips. Rifles were held low but ready. No one aimed unless they had to, but we made it clear we weren't unarmed or unprepared. Even the kids moved. The older ones, 12 to 17, got up from the shade and took their places without being told. The smaller kids were corralled behind the tailgate of one of the trucks, crouched low but out of sight. My little cousin, only 9, held a small .22 with both hands, his face pale but his stance solid. My mom, who walks with canes because of her knees, dropped them to the ground, leaned on the table, and took the AR-15 someone handed her. She didn't hesitate. None of us did. There was a dead silence for a second. The men stopped where they were, halfway between their trucks and ours, clearly realizing they'd walked into a situation they weren't expecting. They looked at us. We looked at them. There were 15 of us standing, each armed, calm, quiet, and absolutely not backing down. I don't know what they were thinking, but the fear was visible in their faces. Maybe they thought they could scare a few unarmed campers. Maybe they didn't expect kids and grandparents to be standing there, ready to defend their people. Whatever plan they had fell apart in real time right in front of us. None of them even reached for their weapons. They just slowly started backing up. One of them, probably the leader, leaned back into the truck cab and muttered something. Then he turned around, called out, "Sorry, wrong spot." And they all piled back in. Engines roared, tires spit gravel. In seconds they were gone, tearing out of the canyon like they couldn't leave fast enough. We stood still for a long moment, watching the dust rise behind them. No one said anything until we heard the engines fade completely into the distance. My uncle and brother didn't waste time. They hopped on the quads, helmets on, and followed at a distance. They knew the desert better than anyone. They didn't have to tail them the whole way. They just needed to cut across the canyon and get to the road before those guys hit the highway. We kept everything calm on our end. A few people resumed shooting, others just sat down again like nothing had happened. But we were all a little more alert now. My dad got on the CB radio to talk to the guys on the quads, gave them direction. Eventually, my uncle called back. Once they hit cell signal near the edge of the range, they phoned it in. Police picked the trucks up at a gas station less than 20 minutes later. Turns out those guys were gang members, wanted for multiple other crimes. Armed robbery, assault. They had stolen weapons in the back of the trucks, and none of them were licensed to carry. One of them was already out on bail for a gun charge. They added a list of new ones to that day's tally. Unregistered firearms, intent to intimidate, unlawful entry to a controlled area. Could have gone very differently if we hadn't been who we were, if we'd hesitated, if we'd panicked, if we hadn't grown up knowing how to handle ourselves when no one else would come help. But we did. That night, after we finished up shooting and packed up the tables, we sat around a fire and talked about it. The older folks shared stories about other times people thought the desert was empty. The kids listened wide-eyed, still holding onto the lessons from the day. We laughed, but it wasn't lighthearted. It was the kind of laughter that comes after something heavy passes you by and doesn't stop. We never went out there unprepared, but that day reminded us why. That's the thing about growing up out here. You learn to stand your ground, not because you want trouble, but because if trouble finds you, you'd better be ready. We kept camping, kept shooting, kept spending time out in the canyons. Nothing changed, really, but we all paid a little more attention from then on. And those guys, they never came back. I was hiking in a forest in Northern California once, deep in one of those areas where the trees stretch endlessly in every direction and the undergrowth is thick enough to make you feel like you're walking through a tunnel of green. My friend and I had planned to do the full loop of the trail that day, about 10 miles. It was the kind of trail where you could go a long while without seeing anyone else, and that's part of what I liked about it. Quiet, isolated, just you and the woods. We had started early with our packs light, mostly snacks and water. Around the third or fourth mile, my friend started to slow down. He told me he was getting a migraine, and it was hitting him hard. He had one of those prescription meds in his bag. But once those hit him, he'd be useless for a few hours. He knew there was a fire road nearby that cut straight back to the campsite, so he told me he was going to take the shortcut and rest. I double-checked he had everything he needed, then watched him disappear down the slope, moving slow and holding the side of his head. I figured I'd finish the trail. It wasn't too far, and I wanted the time alone anyway. The trail got quieter after that. It was just me and the wind brushing through the treetops, the occasional rustle of something small in the brush, birds calling out overhead. I wasn't in a rush, so I moved at a slow, steady pace. I remember the ground was soft, almost spongy in places from the moisture. It had rained a few days earlier, and everything smelled like wet leaves and pine. About halfway down a long descent on the back half of the loop, I started to feel like something had shifted. It wasn't anything obvious, But you know when your body picks up on something your mind hasn't noticed yet? That's what it felt like. Just off. I stopped walking and stood still, listening. That's when I heard the first scream. It was sharp and echoing. Far off but loud enough to make me freeze. At first I couldn't tell what it was. I thought maybe someone had fallen, or maybe some idiot was messing around. But then it came again. Louder, angrier. A wild, bone-deep scream that didn't sound quite human. It was coming from somewhere to my left, downhill, in a thicker part of the woods where the trees closed in tight and the trail curved away. I stayed still, trying to listen. My heart was pounding in my chest. It didn't sound like a person anymore. Not really. It was too guttural, too animal. That's when it hit me, it was probably a mountain lion. I'd read about the sounds they make before. I'd even heard recordings. And sometimes, when they scream, it can sound like a woman being attacked. I just stood there for a few long seconds, frozen. Part of me wanted to make noise, shout, clap, do something to scare it away. That's what you're supposed to do with mountain lions, right? But another part of me, a deeper, older part, was saying don't move. Stay quiet. Listen. Because if it wasn't a mountain lion, then what was it? My mouth was dry. My throat felt like it had closed up. I forced myself to breathe slowly and tried to pinpoint exactly where the sound was coming from. It echoed strangely through the trees, bouncing around, but I could tell it was downhill and a little behind me. It hadn't gotten closer, yet I slowly started walking again, this time deliberately choosing every step, making as little noise as possible. I wasn't running, but I wasn't wasting any time either. My eyes scanned every tree, every shadow. I kept thinking I saw movement just out of the corner of my eye, but it was always just branches or leaves or nothing at all. The screaming came again, this time a little farther off, like it was moving away or circling. It was hard to tell. By the time I made it back to camp, I was shaking. My shirt was stuck to my back with sweat, even though it wasn't hot. My friend was in his hammock, looking half asleep, totally unaware of what I'd just gone through. I didn't say much, just grabbed a bottle of water and sat down, trying to steady my hands. I must have looked like a ghost because he asked if I was all right, and I just nodded. I didn't tell him about the screams until much later. A few months after that, I was at a music festival in the desert. Totally different scene, crowded, loud, full of people. We were camped out in a huge open area packed with tents. There was barely enough room to walk between them. You could hear a dozen different songs playing from all directions, people laughing, talking, partying all through the night. I'd gone with a few friends, but that night it was just me and one of them in our tent. The others had crashed elsewhere. It was early morning dawn, that weird gray light before the sun really comes up. I was half awake, lying on my side in my sleeping bag, my face against the fabric of the tent wall. I heard an engine start close by. At first, I didn't think anything of it. People come and go, even at that hour. Then I heard tires crunching over dry gravel and sand. Closer, a lot closer. I rolled onto my back and looked toward the tent door. Red light was glowing through the thin fabric, tail lights, and they were getting brighter. I sat up just in time to realize a truck was reversing straight toward us. There was no time to yell, no time to unzip the tent or grab anything. I threw my arm over my friend, who was still out cold, and yanked her toward me with everything I had. The second she rolled onto my chest, the back wheel of the truck hit our tent, crushed the corner of it, just flattened it. The sound of nylon ripping, the air mattress deflating under us, and then the unmistakable crunch of metal on tent poles. Our gear in that part of the tent was destroyed. Her sleeping bag was ripped clean down the side. If I hadn't pulled her when I did, that tire would have gone right over her legs. The truck didn't stop. It just kept rolling slowly, then pulled forward again and drove off between other tents like nothing had happened. By the time we got out, heart pounding, the driver was gone. A few people nearby were waking up, looking around, but no one had seen who it was. No plate, no description, just a truck in a sea of them. We reported it to the staff, of course, but nothing ever came of it. They made some announcements, told people to be careful, but that was it. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept replaying it in my head, how fast it all happened, How close it was. The weight of her body on mine, the shaking of the ground, that horrible tearing sound. I still think about both of those days sometimes. Alone in the woods, hearing something that didn't belong. Nearly crushed under a truck because someone was too drunk or stupid to think. People talk about camping and hiking like it's peaceful, and yeah, sometimes it is, but it doesn't take much for everything to go sideways. I've been back out in the woods since then, and I've been to festivals, but I'm never quite as relaxed as I used to be. Now I listen harder. I watch more closely. I never assume I'm safe just because I'm surrounded by trees or people. Sometimes the scariest parts of life aren't the things that go bump in the night. They're the ones that come with an engine or a scream you can't place. And they don't care if you're ready or not. We went camping in the White Mountains of New Hampshire last month, me, my girlfriend, and a mutual friend of ours. It was early spring, still cold at night, and we were up in elevation a bit, so it was chillier than we expected. The campground wasn't completely empty, but it was quiet. Maybe 5 or 6 other sites were in use, scattered out far enough that we felt alone. It was a new moon, so when the sun went down, it got dark. The kind of dark where you can't see your hand in front of your face if your flashlight is off. No city glow out there either, just black woods, cold air, and quiet. We'd gotten to our site mid-afternoon, set up the tent, got a small fire going, and made dinner. The usual stuff. It was a nice night, clear skies, crisp air, and the kind of stillness that makes you feel like you're far from everything. By around 10, we doused the fire and were getting ready to sleep. I remembered the trash had to go up to the dumpster near the entrance, so I offered to take it. The walk wasn't far, maybe 5 minutes up the gravel path to the road and back. I brought a flashlight with me, a small one that clipped to my jacket. It wasn't super bright, but enough to make out the trail. The walk there was uneventful. Cold air, the sound of the gravel under my boots, some wind now and then. I tossed the bag into the dumpster and started walking back. I was about halfway back to our campsite when something caught my eye to the left, in an empty campsite maybe 30 feet off the trail. I stopped walking. First, I thought it was someone. It looked like a tall, pale shape standing toward the back of the empty site, not near the fire ring or table, but further back where the trees started. My first instinct was that it was a person, maybe someone gathering wood or just standing there, but it wasn't moving. I shone my flashlight in that direction and tried to make out what it was. The light wasn't strong enough to reach all the way clearly, but it was enough to catch white. Pale white, vertical, about the height of a person. No movement. I stood there for a bit, squinting, thinking maybe it was a birch tree. There were birch trees in the area. I waited, just watching, expecting some sign of motion. Nothing. Eventually, I told myself that's all it was, just a tree in a weird spot. Something about the contrast made it look like a person. I walked back to our site, still uneasy but not alarmed. We slept in a large 3-person tent. Thick sleeping bags, a couple of foam pads, and extra blankets. It was cold enough that you could see your breath. Sometime after midnight, I woke up needing to pee. I unzipped the tent quietly, trying not to wake the others. I stepped outside barefoot in my boots, just pulling on my jacket and headlamp. As soon as I turned on the headlamp and stepped out, I noticed something strange. Around the tent, in maybe a 10 or 15-foot radius, I saw what looked like glowing red-orange dots. First, I froze. They looked like coals, like someone had scattered them across the forest floor. They weren't everywhere, just in spots. Some were close, maybe 2 or 3 feet from the tent, and others further back toward the woods. They weren't bright enough to cast light, just these faint glowing dots on the ground. I thought maybe it was some kind of fungus or mineral reflection. I crouched down to look closer at one, and it did look a lot like a small coal, round, glowing slightly, but no smoke, no heat, and not burning anything around it. I stood there for a while, just looking. I didn't hear anything. No twigs snapping, no footsteps, just the same still air and that deep, forest quiet. My girlfriend had woken up too and came out a few minutes later, whispering that she had to pee. I pointed at the glowing things. She stopped, looked around, and saw them too. Neither of us said anything. It was too strange, and something about it made us feel like speaking would somehow make it worse. We didn't go far from the tent, just did what we had to and went back in quickly. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I was still trying to convince myself that the glowing dots were maybe mushrooms, maybe some weird mineral or lichen. I even started to wonder if there was some kind of reflection happening from distant campfires or headlights. But when the sun came up and we stepped outside, there was nothing. The forest floor looked normal. Brown needles, leaves, twigs. No signs of any coals. No ash, no burned spots. It was like they were never there. I told the others about the pale figure I thought I saw near the empty site. I led them over to where I remembered it being. The campsite was empty. No tents, no fire. No signs anyone had been there recently. I checked toward the back where I thought I'd seen the pale shape. Nothing but dark bark trees. No birch trees. None close enough to match the spot where I saw it. We didn't talk too much about it at the time. Felt weird, and none of us had a good explanation. We packed up and left that afternoon, drove back home, and that was that. But the memory stuck with us. A few weeks later, we were sitting around at someone's place talking about weird stories, strange things in the woods, local legends. One of us brought up regional cryptids, and we started looking up ones from New Hampshire. That's when we came across mentions of something called the wood devil. The name sounded like something made up, but we kept reading. The descriptions were consistent. Tall, thin, pale creature, human-shaped, but silent. Known for standing completely still, often along the tree line, watching. Usually seen in the north, mostly in Coos County. It blended in with birch trees and was said to freeze if spotted, so it wouldn't be noticed. It was always described as very fast when moving, but often just stood and watched. None of us had heard of it before. I didn't believe in stuff like that, still don't really. But it hit me when I saw those descriptions, the pale figure in the empty site that never moved, that I couldn't make sense of, and the scattered glowing dots later that night. I don't know if they're connected. Could have been two completely separate things. One could have been a trick of the light, the other some weird natural phenomenon I don't understand. But something about it just sits wrong. I've been camping for years, all kinds of places. Forests, deserts, mountains. I know how the dark plays tricks on your eyes, how your brain tries to make sense of shapes and shadows. But this felt different. The figure wasn't shadowy, it was too clear. And the glowing dots weren't imagined. They were right there on the ground, visible to more than just me. We haven't been back to that part of New Hampshire since. We still talk about it now and then, usually when we're around a fire. No one ever tries to come up with an answer. We just leave it there, hanging between us. A night in the woods that didn't quite make sense, and maybe never will.